And Brandon, it is time to not only end our Coastal preview, but end our entire ACC preview for 2017 coming into the season. And last but not least, the Virginia Tech Hokies. And Brandon, this one's easy. They've got quite a few losses that they have to kind of get fixed and kind of fill holes. But the main question I want to start with here with the Hokies is they are a team that won the division last year. Do you see this repeating itself this year, or is this another team like the Tar Heels that we could see take a step back in 2017?
Well, I'll be honest with you. I think that this is a team that I would, if by looking at everything, if you're not looking at any other team in your conference, you look at everything and you look at the losses and you go, no, they're not going to repeat. They're going to take a step backwards. But then when you also look that one of their strongest points on offense is going to be their offensive line, and then knowing, too, what North Carolina is losing, the questions that Miami has, maybe we do see Pitt at the top of this division because of the fact of all these losses that some of these teams at the top are having and it being at the quarterback position. But another thing here for Virginia Tech is that they still do return one of their running backs, Trayvon McMillan, guy who did not get enough work last year, and they openly came out and said that. They said, we did not get him enough reps. We did not get him enough carries. We relied too much on Gerard Evans, and Gerard Evans now is working to find a home in the NFL.
Which was, you even mentioned before we recorded, it was so weird to see, like you expected, okay, Evans will be back next year. What? He's going to the NFL?
Yeah.
Who's going to draft him? And then he went undrafted.
He went undrafted, and he was with the Eagles for a little bit, got injured, and then they just were clearing that up. So now he's no longer on the Eagles, but if he wants to be on the Eagles again, he can be, but he's got to go through some process, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't matter anymore. Yeah. But I think that the loss of him is big. It's 29 touchdowns and 8 interceptions through the air, and then he added on 12 more on the ground. But I think that you get a running game, a steady diet of the running game going, and that's going to help whichever quarterback is going to end up starting here for the Hokies. But at the end of the day, really, I would not be surprised if this team does take a step back and they do not win the Atlantic.
Well, and the
Coastal.
The reason why I could see this team taking a step back has nothing to do with the quarterback situation. It has to do with the playmakers around him. Because right now, Coach Fuente, he has a decision to make. He can either go with a guy that many are assuming will be the starter this year in redshirt freshman Josh Jackson, because as I'm reading from Athlon Sports, that Fuentes likes that he displayed maturity and decision making beyond his age in his first year on campus, or they can go with AJ Bush, who's a junior redshirt transfer from Iowa Western Community College. So that's going to be the battle this fall, is will you go with the redshirt freshman or do you go with the new incoming transfer? But like I mentioned, players around him, they don't have a ton of playmakers. The one that they do have is Cam Phillips, who returns and could finish with could finish his career as the all-time leading receiver for the Hokies. But after that, there's a talent drop-off, and they've got Eric Kuma and Phil Patterson are the next two guys below him. That is a huge drop-off in talent. And I feel like this team this year might be Josh Jackson did good. But, man, if we just had a little bit more weapons for him, think about what he could do. Which this team, that might be their road this season. In recruiting, it might be, we got Josh Jackson. Let's go out in recruiting and get him some weapons. Let's get him some firepower to go to, because that's what we really need. Because not only do they have the talent drop-off this year, at the end of this year, that Cam Phillips guy that I mentioned, he's gone at the end of the year. This is his last year with the Hokies. So that's going to be the big thing, is can they overcome the lack of playmakers on offense?
Well, I think one of the big things is, again, with this team is also the fact that the only team that you're playing from the Atlantic, the big team, is Clemson. There is no Florida State. There is no Louisville. So you don't have to deal with either of those two teams. And then a lot of the games, too, you get to play a lot of the bigger games. You get to play them at home. Clemson is at home. North Carolina is at home. Miami and Georgia Tech, those are on the road. Pitt is at home. So I think that schedule, that home-away split really works out in favor for you while you're at home.
Even like West Virginia. Yes, it's a neutral site, but you don't get to play them at West Virginia. You get them in a neutral site to start the year. That could be a tough game, though, for them, non-conference-wise.
Exactly. But I think that you look at the first 4 to 5 games, and I think that Virginia Tech still, even with kind of where they are right now, I won't say floundering, because that offensive line is going to be pretty darn good. I think that there's some question marks there, but I think they could win 4 out of their first 5 games. They beat Delaware, East Carolina, and Old Dominion for sure. I think they have a chance to beat West Virginia. And then that Clemson game, that's not the Clemson game a year ago. It's not. It's a new game.
No more Deshaun Watson.
No Deshaun Watson.
No Gallman. No Williams.
No Gerard Evans on the other side for Virginia Tech. So that game's game up in the air. I think you beat Boston College. North Carolina. I think you beat North Carolina.
I'd give it to VT right now.
Duke. You beat Duke. Miami.
That's interesting. That's on the road.
Miami, I think that Miami wins.
That's on the road, and that is, we talked about Nikasi Perry. That could be a time of the year where he starts clicking if he's got a few starts under his belt.
But then, Ricky, how about this one? Georgia Tech and Pitt. Right now, if you were to ask me who do you think wins both of these games, I say Georgia Tech and I'd say Pitt.
See, I'd go the opposite. I would go Miami. I'd go Miami right now. Georgia Tech, I would go with Virginia Tech, and Pitt, I would say a coin toss. And the only reason I can't give a winner or a loser for the Pitt game is because I think it would be a disservice of me to say, oh, VT's going to win that game without seeing how Max Brown is doing in that Pittsburgh offense.
Well, Ricky, it's a disservice to everybody by us just saying, I think so-and-so might win. I think so-and-so. But we're just saying
Virginia Tech. I would go with Virginia Tech.
There you go. Now you're being a man and actually giving an answer. I think that ultimately, when you look at this, it is fair to be able to go up and down and say, especially after the teams that we've looked at, the teams that we've already looked at by going through this whole ACC conference and looking at all these teams and where we think that they're at and who they've lost and who they've gained and where they're at, I don't think it's unfair to go through and say, I think that one team over another looks better. Right now, I just Virginia Tech, they're not where North Carolina is, but they're close-ish, where you still have a lot of those question marks.
Yeah, and I think this year the big thing, it's very similar to other teams that we've talked about in this conference. The reason why I am not super nervous about Virginia Tech heading into this year, their defense, Bud Foster's defense, is going to have experience at the linebacker and secondary. His defenses usually do better when he has that experience on that side of the field. So the defense is going to be strong. And to be honest, I'd rather be a Virginia Tech fan right now than North Carolina, than Pitt. Because we talked about North Carolina, we talked about Pitt, and Max Brown, Brandon Harris, although they are transfers, we have questions about them. Me more so with Max Brown, you more so with Brandon Harris. Josh Jackson, he's a redshirt freshman, but let's be honest. We said the same thing about DeAndre Francois with the Florida State Seminoles. And, of course, different quarterback. But if Fuente likes his maturity and what he's displaying, that could be solid for this team. I think the quarterback's not the issue. It's the playmaking around him and who's he going to throw the ball to. Much similar to what Brandon Harris might have to do if he picks things up for North Carolina.
And I think in a lot of these previews, especially with the ones where the quarterback situation has come into question of who's going to be the true starter, who's going to be the solid starter. And I think right now we have to go on the assumption of we're not sure and we don't know how they're going to produce.
It all comes down to fall camp.
And I think that that's pretty fair, though, is the fact that how can we give a good representation of a club and say, yeah, they're going to be great because we're assuming that he's going to be outstanding. How can we say that then? Even with Perry in Miami, I think he's going to be very good, but I don't think he's going to be the guy who's going to be starting right away. Quickly, but not right away. I think that's where you have to temper the expectations right now with a chance to be able to build them up and say, okay, now we've seen a couple of games. We've seen a good sample size of what this quarterback's been able to do. We've seen Jackson in action, and now we think Virginia Tech can win it again, or I don't know, they may be in the middle of the pack. So I think that's really important to point out too, is that we're not trying to downgrade any of these quarterbacks that we really don't know a whole lot about. We don't know how they're going to perform, but it's more temper the expectation for now.
And that's why I waited until this point, because I wanted to get through every team before I brought this up for the Virginia Tech kind of preview, was because of what we talked about, especially here in the Coastal. I feel like this ACC conference, it's either Louisville's or Florida State's to lose. Mainly because you look at the Coastal, you look at the teams that we've talked about. Pitt, they got Max Brown coming in. How's he going to perform this year? Miami, they could be starting a raw true freshman this year. I know Jalen Hurts did it, but still, you get kind of a little nervous when you hear the words raw and true freshman, a guy that needs to develop a little bit. We look at North Carolina, Brandon Harris, he's got to prove himself. Not as much maybe as Max Brown, but he's got to prove himself. And then you look at Virginia Tech, where it's like, yeah, we got a redshirt freshman coming in. Yeah, I know Florida State did the same thing, but Florida State had a lot more playmakers last year around DeAndre Francois, something that Virginia Tech may not have this year. So I look at this, and even if Virginia Tech wins the Coastal, I have a hard time seeing them, and this is where a season's got to play out too. Like you said, we could say whatever we want right now, but the players got to take the field, the players got to play, and then the games become final. That's how football works. However, at the end of the season, what I am visualizing is even if Virginia Tech wins their side of the division, I think it's Louisville or Florida State's conference to lose. Those are the two top. Those are the two favorites in my mind. And Virginia Tech, if they played either of those in a title game, would be the underdog. I'm not saying they'd get blown out, but they would be the underdog in that game.
I think you're right. I think that's based on talent, based on the returning guys that they have, based on their quarterbacks. That's what it seems to be these days, is quarterbacks, and who is anchoring that position.
Most important position on the team.
That is so important. Even if you have a really good running back, as Miami does, just to give it kind of bring it back to this side of the conference that we're talking about right now, Miami has a very good running back. What's going to happen at quarterback? Running back cannot do it all, but they can certainly help. But then you look at those two teams that you mentioned. You've got Lamar Jackson and you got DeAndre Francois, two guys that have gotten it done, will continue to get it done. And I think you're completely right. I think that if they're going up against any other team, right now it looks like they would probably, I'd have them as the favorite, the clear favorite, and the winner. I think that with Virginia Tech, though, is that they have last year, and they look at last year, and they remember last year, they improve a little bit on that, and they win a couple of those games that they narrowly lost, and they still win the games even that they narrowly won. This team can be in the same spot that it was last year, which is not a bad thing, because based on what everyone else looks to be doing, that should then be enough to get them the win in the Coastal.
Yeah, the only teams they lost to last season, Tennessee, who surprisingly blew them out. I didn't think Tennessee was that good of a team overall last year. They lost to Syracuse on the road, then Georgia Tech, and obviously Clemson later in the year in the ACC title game. This is a team that is my favorite to win the Coastal side. However, I feel like the true ACC title game, the one that will decide who wins the conference, will come between when Louisville and Florida State play. Whoever wins that game will most likely win the ACC and will maybe represent their side in the college football playoff. But before I end this podcast, before we end everything, any last thoughts, anything we missed from the Hokies?
A final thing I want to say on them is that last year defenses, they held opposing teams to a third down conversion percentage of 27% on third down. That's something that's really impressive. They keep up numbers like that. They keep those numbers low. They get those offenses off the field, get their offense back on the field. That's going to be something really important as well. Defense this year for a lot of these teams, especially on the coastal side of things, is going to be important to have a strong defense. We've seen a lot where it's, if you can have a strong defense, you've got a good offensive line. If they can keep that quarterback upright, if they can find some holes for the running back, that can be a good balance. Defense could win that ACC this year. It may not all be offense.
Well, and that is going to do it for our Coastal preview, but not just that, for our ACC preview. We have been through it all, and this is where you guys come in. Let us know, especially Hokie fans on YouTube. Let us know down below what you guys think of your team heading into this season. I want to thank you guys for listening to the Primetime Podcast today. Another thing, we got a few questions about it last week with our Atlantic preview. Swanee's final thoughts ain't going anywhere. We're just taking a hiatus with the Swanee's final thoughts while we're doing this whole preview thing because, as you guys saw, if you're listening on Blog Talk Radio, they're going to be really long podcasts. So Brandon and Swanee's final thoughts will return after we finish the previews towards the beginning of the college football season. But I want to thank you guys for checking out the podcast today. Make sure to hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and if you're on Blog Talk Radio, hit that follow button. If you want to help the channel more so than doing that, check out patreon.com/Most Valuable Podcast. I want to thank you one more time for listening and watching, and as always, have a good day, everybody.